first subsection of this section of notes, which is over changes and challenges to political and territorial arrangements, is devolution. In this subsection of devolution, we're going to be looking at the devolution of countries in regards to centripetal and centrifugal forces. A recurring set of forces affects all nation states. The first is centripetal forces. These are those that unify, and then there's centrifugal, which are forces that tend to fragment nation states. Now, first we're going to focus on centripetal forces. These are forces that bind together the people of a state, giving it strength. A key vocabulary word to identify in centripetal forces is nationalism. Nationalism, or identities based on nationhood, are one of the most powerful centripetal forces. Nationalism encourages allegiance to a single country. Nationalism promotes loyalty, and nationalism promotes commitment to that nation state as well. Symbols are also powerful tools for creating national unity. For example, in the United States, we have the American flag, and despite the heterogeneous population of the United States, meaning despite all of the different cultures that are represented in the United States, this American flag does a great job of uniting the people under the concept of a nationalist type symbol. Now, the next type of force, again, that opposes centripetal forces is centrifugal forces. These forces destabilize the government and encourage the country to fall apart. For example, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union is a great example. In 1917, the Soviet Union grounded people in the ideology of communism, and to strengthen the state, they forbid the practice of Eastern Orthodoxy. They told the people that you couldn't do it. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved, the church just reappeared, meaning it was never really gone. The Eastern Orthodox Church was a centrifugal force that helped to divide the Soviet Union because these people believed in this force and they didn't totally believe in the force of communism. Now, nationalism, which was a vocabulary word under centripetal forces, can also be a destabilizing force, especially if different ethnicities within the country have more loyalty to their ethnicity than to their state. These loyalties are often lead to the vocabulary term of separatist movements, meaning nationalities that demand independence. The Soviet Union, another good example, because it just seems to always fall apart. The Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Georgians, and the Armenians all had separatist movements with independent ethnicities that demanded their independence. One reaction states have had to centrifugal is devolution, or the decentralization of decision-making to regional governments. For example, Great Britain has devolved power to the Scottish and the Welsh parliaments to keep peace within Scotland and Wales. So this devolution is talking about the separation of power and decentralizing power to regional governments in the case of Great Britain. Now switching gears, we're looking at devolution, ethnicity, economic, and spatial forces. Again, devolution of government powers to subgovernments is usually a reaction to centrifugal forces, those that divide and destabilize. There's three basic types of devolutionary forces: ethnic forces, economic forces, and spatial forces. The first force of devolutionary is ethnic forces. One vocabulary word that I want to point out to you is ethno-nationalism. Ethno-nationalism is the tendency for an ethnic group to see itself as a distinct nation with a right to autonomy or independence. This is a fundamental centrifugal force promoting devolution. For example, in Canada, you have French Canadians in the province of Quebec. If ethnically the French were scattered all over Canada, Quebec would have no independence movements. But because Quebec is full of French nationalists who want to break away, hence centrifugal force, then the province of Quebec has independence movements. Another type of devolutionary force is an economic force. Economic inequalities may also destabilize a nation state, particularly if the inequalities are regional. For example, Italy is split between the north and the south by the Ancona line. This is an invisible line extending from Rome to the Adriatic coast. The northern side of this Ancona line is very prosperous because it's close to Europe. It's the European core area. It's very industrial, and the south is very rural. The south is not so prosperous. They're not doing very well. There was a Northern League that was formed, which called for northern independence from the, quote, economic drag of the South. This movement failed, but it did encourage the Italian government to devolve power to regional governments, moving to a more federal system rather than a unitary system. Now, number 3, spatial forces. Spatially, devolutionary events most often occur on the margins of the state. Distance, remoteness, and peripheral location. These promote devolution, especially if water, desert, or mountains separate the areas from the center of powers, and neighboring nations that may support separatist objectives. Now, the first case study that I want to look at is Puerto Rico. This is a United States territory in the Caribbean Sea. The United States wants to add Puerto Rico as a state, but Puerto Rico consistently votes for that not to happen because of spatial forces. Spatial forces it is an island, and Puerto Rico is close to other islands that have their independence. And because of these spatial devolutionary forces, they consistently vote no into adopting as a state into the United States. Now, your next major subsection is supranational organizations, changing the meaning of sovereignty. A supranational organization is an organization that's been around for some time now, but their nature is changing with real implication on sovereignty of nations. A supranational organization is one that many different nations are joining together in regards to a certain issue. There's many different examples. The first that we're going to look at is the Concert of Europe in the early 19th century. The Concert of Europe was set to restore the balance of power after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. This helped with relative peace throughout Europe until World War I. So it was a peaceful time in Europe after Napoleon Bonaparte where they divided up Europe and helped to maintain peace. Number 2, the League of Nations. This was created right after World War I, but it was doomed from the start until World War II because of the implications that it put on Germany. Number 3, the United Nations. The United Nations was formed in 1945. In the beginning, there were only 49 states, and it's now grown to over 193 member states. Membership is voluntary, but it has limited powers to force its members to abide by the organization's peacekeeping principles. In other words, they don't really have any power to force its members to do things that the organization has. They can just issue fines and even kick them out of the United Nations, which a lot of times is not very effective. The United Nations also changes the nature of sovereignty by applying the concept to an organization with collective membership, not just to individual nation states. Inside the United Nations, there was a Security Council set up. This was a body responsible for establishing a peacekeeping force in a, quote, hotspot and request states to contribute military force. In other words, if there's an issue going on in regards to military efforts, the Security Council can set forth motions so that member states contribute military personnel to help out with different hotspots. During the Cold War, there was a gridlock. This gridlock is now broken, but decision-making is still difficult. The reason there was a gridlock was parts of member nations were siding with Soviet Union, parts of member nations were siding with the United States. So there's a gridlock, and the United Nations did not step in. This is an umbrella organization with many different sub-organizations. The efforts from this organization are funded by membership dues and represent an extension of international cooperation into areas other than peacekeeping. The next major supranational organization, we're looking at regional organizations. And one of the examples is the Cold War regional alliances. You had NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and you had the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union's alliance group. There's also OAS, which is the Organization of American States. This was created to promote social, cultural, political, and economic links among member states. There's also the Arab League. This promotes interest and sovereignty of countries in the Middle East. And the last example we're going to look at in regards to regional organizations is the OAU, Organization for African Unity. This has promoted the elimination of minority, white-ruled governments in Southern Africa. And a specific case study example of that is South Africa with the apartheid movement and Nelson Mandela. Then number 5, the European Union. The European Union is a regional organization that promises to redefine the meaning of sovereignty. Because just like its name, it's geographically located in Europe. Integration is occurring through processes. The European Union began as an effort to revitalize Europe after World War II. The first issue that happened was with the Maastricht Treaty. There were name changes going on. The Maastricht Treaty created the modern organization of the European Union. It created 3 pillars. The first was trade and economic. The European Central Bank was created. The common currency of the euro was created. And member nations were asked to join the European Central Bank as well as to adopt the euro as their common currency. And a lot of nations have. The second pillar established by the Maastricht Treaty was justice and home affairs, governing asylum and border crossing, immigration, and judicial cooperation on crime and terrorism. So it's affecting things that go on in Europe, such as borders, immigration trends, and those sorts of things. The main thing we need to get out of this pillar is that guest workers are promoted and people can move among member nations however often they want to as guest workers and work in member nations and then go back home whenever they want to. This is what makes the European Union a lot different than NAFTA in North America, because in North America you can't just move wherever you want to move in between nations and work. But in the European Union you can. These guest workers can do that. Number 3, a common foreign and security policy, including joint positions and actions and common defense policies. So to protect the continent as a whole, there's security policies, there's military organizations set up so that they can create a common defense policy. Today, the euro is the currency in 12 member countries. Great Britain and Sweden are among those that still refuse to give up their common currency for the euro. Organization within the European Union is very difficult because you have a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas.